Rome, the heart of the world's greatest empire, where the most powerful men walked among the miserable without even noticing their existence. But that day, a simple slave did the unthinkable. He humiliated a man in the streets of Rome. He shouted, he insulted, he exposed his revolt. He said everything he thought about the rulers. But there was one detail. He didn't know who that man was. The people around him began to whisper. The slave realized that something was wrong. And then the truth came out. The man he had insulted was none other than Marcus Aurelius, the emperor himself. The crowd held its breath. The slave realized the size of his mistake. But what Marcus Aurelius did next was something no one expected. Now, discover this surprising story, which proves why Marcus Aurelius was one of the greatest leaders in history. The sun was burning the streets of Rome. The forum was packed with merchants, commoners, and soldiers. Amid the buzz of conversation and the clink of coins, a slave carried heavy sacks on his shoulders, sweat dripping down his forehead. With every step, he felt the injustice burning inside him. As he bent under the weight of the load, the patricians passed him by without even looking. He wasn't a man. He was a shadow. And that filled him with rage. That day, he couldn't bear to be silent any longer. That's when he saw a man standing in the square, watching the movement with a serene gaze. He was wearing a simple tunic, no jewelry, no ostentation. To the slave, he looked like just another privileged Roman. And that was his mistake. He approached with firm steps, his heart racing with accumulated frustration. "You!" His voice cut through the air. "Are you comfortable, watching everything without getting dirty? Without feeling hungry? Without knowing what it's like to be treated like an animal?" The man turned around slowly. His eyes were calm, without arrogance. "What do you want, friend?" he asked in a calm voice. But the slave didn't want to talk. He wanted to be heard. He pointed at the rich men passing by. "You patricians think you're superior. You live surrounded by gold while we kill ourselves for a piece of bread. You talk about greatness, but you've never felt the real pain of life." The crowd began to take in the scene. Some commoners stopped to listen. The whispers began. The man remained silent, just watching. But the slave wasn't finished. Where are the rulers now? Where is the much-talked-about philosopher-emperor? Is he also hiding behind marble walls? Does he also believe that to rule is to sit on a throne while others suffer? The crowd's eyes widened. He didn't know. But he had already gone too far. The man took a deep breath. Then he gave a small smile. "You speak with great certainty about a man you've never met." The slave clenched his fists. "And why should I know him? Does he know me?" Silence hung in the air. Then someone in the crowd whispered, "It's Marcus Aurelius." The slave frowned, not understanding. "What?" Another plebeian pulled him by the arm, his eyes wide. "It's the emperor. You're talking to Marcus Aurelius." The slave's heart froze. The man he had humiliated was none other than the ruler of Rome. The blood disappeared from his face. His knees went weak. He had made a mistake that could cost him his life. But Marcus Aurelius just stood there, calm as ever. And what he would say next would change everything. The air seemed heavier. The whole square was holding its breath. The slave felt his chest tighten. His body froze. He had insulted the emperor of Rome himself. If Marcus Aurelius wanted to, He could have him thrown to the lions right now. He could order his execution without hesitation. He had made the biggest mistake of his life. The soldiers were already alert. One of them approached, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "Your Majesty, one order, and we'll get you out of here." But Marcus Aurelius raised his hand slightly. "Not yet." The soldiers stopped. The slave, trembling, fell to his knees. "I'm sorry, my lord. I didn't know." He lowered his head, expecting the worst, waiting for the sentence. But it didn't come. Instead, Marco Aurelio bent down in front of him. The crowd caught its breath. The emperor kneeling before a slave? The man who ruled the largest empire in the world was at the same height as the one who owned nothing. And then he spoke. "If you had known, would you have spoken differently?" The slave raised his head, confused. "Minus I would never have said those words, sir." Marcus Aurelius tilted his head slightly. "So you didn't speak the truth. You only said what you thought was safe." The slave swallowed. The crowd murmured. What was going on? Marcus Aurelius continued, his voice quiet but firm. "You said that rulers live surrounded by gold and never know pain. But I've seen hunger. I've buried a child. I've walked the battlefields and held dying men in my arms." The slave's eyes fluttered. "Minus I didn't know." Marcus Aurelius nodded slightly. "You didn't know because you never asked. You just assumed." The crowd was paralyzed. What was that? A punishment? A lesson? A conversation? The slave lowered his head again. His anger was gone. Now all that remained was shame. "Are you going to punish me?" Marcus Aurelius smiled slightly. "For what? You already carry your own punishment." The slave felt a shiver run up his spine. That sentence weighed more than any whip. Marcus Aurelius stood up, wiping the dust from his tunic. "A man who speaks without knowing is like an archer who shoots without aiming. He hits the wrong target and only realizes it too late." He looked around. "You've all heard his words. Many here have thought like him." The crowd remained silent. They knew it was true. Marcus Aurelius took a deep breath and turned to the slave one last time. "What you do with this mistake depends only on you." The slave nodded slightly, still unable to answer. He had gone in there as an angry man, but now he was leaving as a thoughtful man. Marco Aurelio looked up at the sky for a moment. The sun continued to scorch the streets of Rome. The day would continue. The truth, however, would remain engraved in the minds of all who were there. The emperor turned his back and went on his way. But the lesson he left behind would change that slave's life forever. The forum returned to its normal rhythm. The merchants continued selling. The citizens went their separate ways, and the soldiers resumed their positions. But for that slave, nothing was the same anymore. He was still on his knees, the dust rising around him, while his mind was spinning. What had just happened? He had expected punishment. He was sure that his life would end right then and there. But instead, he had been taught a lesson. He looked up and saw that some people were still watching him. Some with contempt, others with admiration. But they all knew that he had witnessed something rare. The old shopkeeper who had previously pulled his arm approached him again, his expression filled with incredulity. "Do you understand what happened, boy?" The slave, still stunned, shook his head. The merchant laughed softly, and crossed his arms. "You humiliated the most powerful man in Rome, and he responded with wisdom, not force." The slave swallowed. That was what bothered him. All his life, he had believed that the powerful were all the same, that rulers were arrogant and cruel, without exception. But Marcus Aurelius was different. The merchant bent down beside him and whispered, "A man can be judged by the way he treats those below him. What does that say about our emperor?" The slave remained motionless. His certainties were crumbling. If Marcus Aurelius had had him killed, he would have accepted it, because that's what he expected from the powerful. But the emperor didn't follow the script he had imagined. And now, what to do with this truth? He stood up slowly. He still didn't know the answer, but he knew that he was no longer the same man as before. He looked at the horizon. Perhaps it was time to learn. The slave walked through the streets of Rome, but now everything seemed different. The patricians he had once seen as untouchable gods now seemed like ordinary men. Men who, like him, made mistakes, felt afraid, and had doubts. But there was something even greater weighing on his mind: the truth itself. He had spent his life hating those in power, believing that they were all corrupt, selfish, and insensitive. And then he insulted an emperor in front of everyone. And Marcus Aurelius didn't punish him. On the contrary, he showed him that a true ruler doesn't need force to win. He stopped in front of a fountain, watching the water flow. His reflection was there, distorted by the movement. That was the truth. It had always been there, but he had never looked close enough to see it clearly. A young commoner, who had also witnessed what had happened in the forum, approached. "Aren't you saying anything?" he asked, curious. "Before, I was so sure of your words." The slave remained silent. He still felt the anger inside him. But now, it no longer seemed as strong as before. The young man crossed his arms. "You weren't the only one who thought that," he said. "Many of us believe that the powerful never listen, that they never care. But today, we saw something different." The slave looked up. "You mean I was wrong?" The young man hesitated for a moment, then shook his head. "Non, brother. You weren't wrong to question. You were wrong to already have all the answers." The slave pressed his lips together. That was the truth that hurt the most. All his life, he had believed that he already understood everything about the world, but he had never stopped to think that maybe there was something more. The young man took a step back and smiled slightly. "If you want an answer, perhaps you should ask the emperor himself." The slave's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" The young man laughed. "Marcus Aurelius walks around Rome unescorted, without a golden chariot. He doesn't hide in the palace. He talks to people. If you want, you can meet him again." The slave remained silent. The thought had never crossed his mind. What if he really went after the emperor? What if he listened instead of just talking? He looked at the horizon. All his life, he had believed that his voice would never be heard. But now, he realized that he also needed to learn to listen. The slave spent the next few days reflecting. The experience with Marcus Aurelius never left his mind. He tried to follow his routine, carrying goods, taking orders, but everything seemed different now. For the first time, he realized that his anger was getting him nowhere. But what if, instead of talking, he listened? The thought consumed him. What if he tried to understand what made Marcus Aurelius so different? And so he made a decision. The next morning, he walked to the forum exactly where he had challenged the emperor. He looked around, took a deep breath, and asked a shopkeeper, "The emperor, does he still walk around Rome?" The man raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Yes, he passes through here often. But why?" The slave hesitated for a moment, then answered, "Because I want to hear him this time." The merchant smiled slightly and pointed to one of the streets leading to the city center. "If that's what you want, it won't be difficult to find you." The slave nodded and started walking. Now, he wasn't looking for a confrontation. He was looking for an answer. The slave walked through the streets of Rome, this time with a different purpose. Before, he believed that he already knew all the answers, that the powerful never listened, that the rulers never cared. But now, he had doubts. And that meant that, for the first time, he was ready to learn. When he arrived at the forum, he saw a small group of people gathered in a corner. Among them was Marcus Aurelius. The emperor was talking calmly to a group of citizens. No escort, no crown, just a man among other men. The slave stopped and watched from afar. Marcus Aurelius noticed his presence, and he smiled. The slave took a deep breath and approached. This time, not angrily, not with insults. When he got close enough, Marcus Aurelius looked directly at him and nodded slightly. "You're back." The slave hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I want to understand." Marcus Aurelius held his gaze for a moment. Then he smiled slightly and pointed to a stone bench beside him. "Then sit down. Let's talk." The crowd watched in silence. The slave, who had previously insulted the emperor himself, now sat next to him, not as a rebel, but as an apprentice. The lesson was complete. Marcus Aurelius did not win with force. He won with wisdom. And now, he who had previously spoken without thinking was learning to listen. Marcus Aurelius could have had that slave arrested. He could have punished him, silenced him, made an example of him. But instead, he transformed him. A leader's true strength lies not in his ability to crush opponents, but in his ability to guide those who err towards the truth. The slave entered the forum full of anger, believing that he already knew everything. But in the end, he realized that he had never stopped to listen. And this is the question that remains for you. How often do we speak without thinking? How many times do we judge before we understand? If this story made you think, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Here, we explore the lessons of history's great masters to strengthen your mind and your life. See you in the next video. Remember, wisdom doesn't shout, it waits to be heard.